And yes, thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got our very special guest, Nom with Nom Nom Data. Please feel free to tell us about yourself whenever you're ready to get started. We're in no rush. We've got the whole hour, of course. Just sent that last push of a reminder for attendees. But yeah, I'll pass the mic over to you, and I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and take myself off video. But let me know when you're ready to launch that first question that you had in the poll, and I'll go ahead and do that for you.
Yeah, happy to get started. So I'm Nom, founder of Nom Nom Data, and I've been helping companies manage, process, consume, deliver data to stakeholders for the last 2 decades. And I've been lucky enough to deal with everything from crazy relational systems that have hundreds, sometimes thousands of tables, and the problems, the maintenance challenges, the issues and people producing those kinds of structures and then maintaining them long term, as well as dealing with a lot of like more, I would say, modern, maybe not the right word, but maybe more popular in recent time, NoSQL systems, the challenges of pulling data from those types of systems, doing things at scale, and been lucky enough to work with billion-dollar gaming companies, I guess, that have billions of events. And so, one of the things that I think is really interesting in the data space is data is unique. It can be a lot harder than it seems, and problems get real when you start dealing with a lot of data, and you have to have had a certain level of experience to be able to share kind of the horror stories and the challenges of $100,000 accidental AWS bills when processing data. And those are the kinds of things that hopefully will address a little bit, because I think in many cases data people or data engineers, they're not always the producers of the data. They're just kind of victims of the things that other teams, other groups, other services produce. But they always have to be the ones responsible for the delivery, the outcome, both in terms of the maintenance, sustainability, but also in terms of the cost and the effectiveness of what comes out of that. So really excited to be here today and share a lot of learnings over a lot of experience. And in many cases, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's no different in terms of data, and especially for data-driven companies. So the first comment that I have, or question that I have for people here, and Jake, and this is where we can do the poll. I just wanted to get a feel for the core reasons or the drivers for why people kind of came to this webinar. I think some people might be interested in understanding a little bit more about infrastructure, foundations, technology choices that would be beneficial for companies working in data, for gaming companies. Some people might be interested in how to save cost, and some people might be interested in maybe just expertise, just knowledge on how to do things slightly more efficiently, when to find or hire the right people, all sorts of different challenges. So, and if you have any kind of like other comments for this poll, feel free to type them in, and we can, just being aware of the things that you guys are interested will help me direct the conversation, I think, into a more valuable path for everyone attending. Along those lines, at any point during this webinar, if you guys have any questions, feel free to type them in. We'll kind of aggregate the questions and answer the majority of them at the end. I think that we tend to have a lot of overlapping questions whenever we do things like this. Nobody ever really thinks that they're the first person to ever hit these data challenges, but a lot of people have to hit and go through the same data challenges as they go through their data journeys, and especially in gaming. All right.
Okay.
So
looks like I just shared the poll example. I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but everyone should be able to see it. But if not, most people are interested in building like good data foundations. So really sort of those the fundamental, the foundational aspects with an additional finding resources, people supporting data projects. So getting that expertise, and then others.
Awesome. So kind of per maybe the bio or the advertisements, the main things that we're going to talk about are a couple common mistakes that companies make, some tips to be 10x more efficient, and then core infrastructure components that I think a lot of gaming companies, if they build this early on, it's one of those things that could potentially survive longer than many of the games that these gaming companies produce. And so at the beginning, it'll probably be really quick tidbits of things. And then as we get to more of the core infrastructure components, there'll be a lot more conversation because there's a lot of opinions about technologies and the interactions and how things work together that we'll be able to get into. But the very first thing that I kind of see organizations make in terms of challenges is timestamps. And this is such a fundamental thing. I mean, I remember this being an issue back in the 90s, and just depending on who's building or creating the data, it's happened in super tiny companies, it's happened in big companies, and it ties into the next issue. But it's always so useful to understand when events were created, when they get updated, and this helps, not only in terms of like understanding the interactions and activities that happen on your data, but also how you can sync it and move it from like state to state, from system to system. If you don't have stuff like this, what tends to happen is you have to do what's called like full dumps of information, which is highly inefficient. It works, at small scale. If you have thousands of users, it's not a big deal. But we work with clients that have hundreds of millions of users, and obviously those kinds of things don't scale. And it's something that is really easy, I think, for companies to overlook at first when they're trying to move quickly. And moving quickly happens at startups. It happens at big companies when you're trying to like ninja projects into the budget and things like that. So definitely one of the big things that we see almost everywhere. That's very helpful. This is definitely the ounce of prevention if you can put this in. Another issue that we see pretty often, and I would say it based on the technology, if you're in more of a relational database for a lot of your initial data structures, this happens a little bit less because it's just naturally harder to like make changes to relational databases. When people start going more towards NoSQL structures for storing like player information, user information, the consistency of that may fluctuate a little bit more wildly. And it really depends on, I think a lot of it happens because developers that are operating in that, producing the data, change over time. And they're kind of free to just make whatever changes they want. And so this is a really big deal down the line, because you could imagine if, you're looking for, I don't know, shorts or socks of a particular color or something on the left side, you can find it really quickly. But if things are inconsistent, messy, events aren't structured consistently, and you're having to kind of reorganize things every time you're looking at it, when you start dealing with hundreds of millions, billions of events and having to do that kind of deep dive and minutia to understand what's going on within your games, you're creating a recipe for slowness, right? Inefficiency. And it's not just like it's the difference between getting queries in minutes and doing analysis in minutes versus days to months. So it's pretty massive in terms of efficiency. This is another area where ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And all this stuff is really upfront. And if I were to say like, please don't make XYZ mistakes, these are the top two, and everything else is kind of like not really a mistake, right? Like you have product people, they may track events that are useless. That happens. You know, you're going to create new events all the time, and that happens. That's normal. But as long as those things are consistent, um, the organization can move quickly, do analysis quickly, and the core components that you guys have, as long as those are consistent, those are generally very stable. It'll go a really, really long way. The next thing that I'd like to talk about are kind of two core tips and tricks to make organizations highly efficient. And data just naturally, as time goes on, gets more complicated. I've without, you know, a heavy project, some sort of significant effort, you generally don't see consolidation. And the bigger the organization is, the more risk there is, right, for doing those kinds of projects. And so, you know, typically we see systems living for decades within organizations because they're just so stable. And so any kind of simplification of the ingestion that you can do from a data structure design kind of perspective, it just pays massive dividends down the road. And I would kind of simplify from a foundational perspective, the data that you want to collect. Obviously, you have data around the users. You'll probably have some data around transactions, like purchases, things like that. And then you have kind of a bucket of like all the other events. And in theory, you could create just like a single event driven pipe where you just submit everything into one, you know, call it API endpoint or Kinesis stream or one collection. And I've seen that work. It has certain types of challenges, and it really simplifies things for a lot of the developers when they're trying to send information to the backends. But I would definitely try to keep this, you know, five or less kind of ways that you're ingesting data, because eventually you're just going to add other things. You're going to have third-party SaaS systems that you're going to be integrating with, and that's just, you know, more complication. How do you merge that in? How do you keep that in sync? Do you have to submit data back to those systems? I've seen a lot of companies purely operate on top of some other system, whether it be a content management system, whether it be some game platform like Skills, or for example. And there's a lot of challenges of using some of those systems that, you know, you don't want to operate with like 3 or 4 of those things at any given time. And most companies, when they kind of think about the benefits of what types of information they have for their business, you know, the difference of like, is it worth it to give 30% of a cut of our gaming transactions to this company, or 70%, or whatever the percentage is? A lot of companies boil down to building their own ingestion process here, because the accuracy of the data, the ability to have control over what those transactions are, is really powerful long term. And so it does take a lot of thought. And, you know, I was talking with some developers the other day, or you've seen maybe some memes around this, where it's like, you know, everything starts off really simple when you're starting out, and then over time, I would say maybe mid-tier in my career, I made a lot more complicated kind of systems that had a ton of interactions. And then now I'm just like, God, the maintenance of all of that stuff, like remembering all that stuff, dealing with churn. I remember some people building some more complicated ingestion processes. And then if those people left, it was like the company was just stuck managing this complicated thing that they didn't really understand. So, you know, simplifying the ingestion is one of the things I think a lot of mature companies do to become so much more efficient. And the efficiency trickles down across the entire organization. So I would say this is huge. It's definitely more from like a data or kind of like architectural perspective, not so much the infrastructure, but you know, it goes hand in hand. The next thing that I think a lot of companies do to become highly efficient, and this ties back a little bit to that timestamp issue that we talked about early on, is delta processing. You know, Delta Lake, I think is kind of a buzzword these days. You know, S3 data lakes, things like that. And partitioning is always, I think, a bit of a challenge because it kind of limits your ability, if your partitions aren't set up correctly, to process new information. But we have some clients that are producing terabytes of data per day, and there's almost no way to get near real-time analytics and processing if you're recalculating information, let's say, on a daily basis, right? I see a lot of pipelines or analysts, you know, Airflow kind of like by default has daily processing, and that creates a lot of inefficiencies if you try to amp that up to, let's say, hourly, right? You're recalculating a day's worth of data over time. And so by creating timestamps of when things move from stage to stage, you're actually able to calculate metrics, KPIs, just on the new information that you've seen. And you know, things, even for these companies that are producing terabytes of data, it takes minutes to calculate when your system's that big, right? Versus, I think I see a lot of queries where maybe analysts will say, we'll calculate, you know, 7-day XYZ, and they have to, you know, do now minus 7 days on a regular basis to do that calculation all the time. There's much more efficient ways of doing these calculations, and delta processing is a huge thing. And I would say any company operating at scale has to have delta processing in its toolkit. You know, cool. I think the next thing that I would like to talk about kind of evolves around data teams and structures, and maybe a lot of companies when they start out, I would say they don't have data engineering teams. It's just not what they start out with. And so a lot of product teams, a lot of engineering teams kind of have to build the eventing systems for a lot of this stuff. And so, you know, I think data engineers can definitely help. They can provide a ton of insights. They can help you make mistakes. And so if you can work with someone part-time or some experts in a consulting capacity, that'll probably help you guys, gaming companies in general, go a long way in terms of architecting and saving on cost for some of this stuff, because those are the guys that kind of have to deal with the fallout of all that stuff. And then definitely, you know, you build your game, you have data coming in, you've got someone kind of like cleaning it up, making it look pretty, making it consistent. And then you have your analysts and your data scientists kind of doing value add for the business in terms of garnering insights, making algorithms, making things, or, you know, optimizing purchases and things like that. But the event systems is this really kind of core piece that in recent times, there's kind of 3 main systems that I've seen companies employ for doing this. The first is the icon, I think, for like compute. So, you know, this is basically just creating your own virtual servers to just have an API endpoint. Maybe it's kind of almost like a webhook type deal, but it just takes in any and all kinds of requests. It does the validation, it kind of packages up the events, and these systems, man, when they're built and they're stable and they live a long time, they just live forever. I see a lot of older companies kind of have these systems, and you know, they probably have some team that they pay just to like sit and manage those things and make sure that they're running. but at the scale that a lot of these companies are, and the cost savings for doing that, it's well worth it. The next one, I believe, is the symbol for Kinesis. And so Kinesis is Amazon's kind of event streaming system. I would say this is another popular strategy that I've seen people employ. There's some issues that I see downstream with this, and I think many people would be like, oh, it's worth the cost. Some companies, if you were to use something like a segment, I would say it's a slightly easier packaged version of this for companies. But I'd say one of the issues that I see with streaming is twofold. One is like the cost structure for gaming companies may not always make sense. And especially with Kinesis, it starts off pretty simple. But if you kind of base everything on the streaming of the events, like if you're sending billions of events from your clients, these things are priced per event, kind of payload size, things like that. And it can get fairly expensive. And then the other downside of that is if, when people kind of go this route, they tend to jump into kind of event driven architectures where they like send one event to another event to another event. And that kind of creates this really big mess of things where things could potentially go wrong. And it kind of ties to that simplification of pipeline and data. The simpler you can keep your event systems, the easier it is to debug. And then, for Kinesis specifically, it's like every event that you send it to, it basically doubles the cost. So if you basically have all your events kind of come through Kinesis and then they all go through a Lambda Firehose, it's like you're paying the cost of 2 events firing to land on S3. And then at the scale of dealing with billions of events and terabytes of data a day, now you've also got to think about the optimization of the cost of like the landing zones, which I'll kind of touch into after this. But it's a really interesting problem to deal with at scale, and definitely not one of the things people kind of think about at the beginning, because it's just so easy to get started on any of these systems, right? And that's kind of how they lock you in. I think a lot of times as the companies get really big, they eventually kind of reevaluate and they're like, oh my God, we can save tens of millions of dollars by just like hosting our own servers and hiring a guy to like sit on it. It starts to make a lot of financial sense. And it's not necessarily something where I'm saying like, don't do this. Obviously, every company kind of has to make the decision, like, is it worth it to create this potential technical debt where I know that like this was really easy to get set up on. I know it's not what we're going to be on when we're, $1 billion gaming company, but at least for now, it's way cheaper than hiring a person, right? So just be kind of cognizant of that in the event streaming systems. The last one, I believe, is a Google Google Firestore. I've seen a lot of gaming companies use this as kind of their event streaming. It seems to work really well. I would say pricing model wise, it's a little bit easier because it's kind of like landing in almost like landing in a database that persists. You kind of have more databasey type costs associated with it. Disk space becomes an issue. IOPS kind of becomes an issue. Reads and writes is kind of how those things get charged. In an Amazon world, this would be your DynamoDB. I've seen companies on Amazon use DynamoDB as their kind of event systems for these things. If you're going to do that, the main components that you need to care about are, once again, timestamps, right? You're using a data store that is typically key value. You're going to have to create indexes, secondary indexes, typically for Dynamo, and also indexes in Firestore, so that you can pull the data out. You only want to pull out the differences. We had one client where, they thought they had some indexes on the, I guess, updated fields. They had the updated fields, but because they didn't have the indexes there, and all these NoSQL systems, it basically did an entire table scan, even though the system was only pulling, the latest million rows. In order to know what the latest million rows were, it had to scan every single record in the table because there was no index on that stuff. And so those are things that sometimes the data teams are in control of. Most of the time, they're not. And these are really kind of foundational things that have a lot of longer lasting impacts into the foundation and future of gaming companies. And one of the things that, the last icon, never use a relational database for this. It's simply too rigid. Gaming companies just have all sorts of different kinds of events coming through. You don't want to deal with creating, tables for each of these things. I think the flexibility of JSON semi-structured data here is just fantastic. And the maintenance, out of storage issues, indexing, adding columns on a relational database, it's like nobody uses that for their event systems. I think there's companies that use it for, like transactional or, user registration type systems, right? And that at that scale, it makes sense. Those kinds of data structures are a little bit more foundational. But I would say if like you're trying to track, lobby entrances and bonus events and clicks, dobs for bingo, those kinds of things. It's like every time someone does a combat for dice rolls or whatever kind of game that you guys have is, the type of data you're going to store with those things will slowly change over time. As much as you're trying to be consistent, you're just going to add new stuff, and you're just going to have a lot of those events and interactions. You need something that will scale. So that's all super critical, very important to get right early. And I would say for every company that we worked with that's gotten it right, you probably have less support issues than Amazon has outages a year. So, which in my head, I'm like, Amazon has an outage at least once a year. I don't know if everybody else sees the same thing, although this year might have been a little bit worse for them. The next thing that is a really good foundation before, you have to hire a team of analysts or data science to do things, after you have your event systems kind of in place, is the landing zone for the data. And so here it's really interesting, and there's definitely a lot of overlap. But I would say, some people land their data into databases, and some people land their data into file stores like S3. There's various S3 alternatives out there, but I would say they don't really integrate that well, kind of like how S3 integrates with things. And so I've seen them just be a little bit less useful in terms of using as a data lake or landing zone for all this data, and especially once I'm assuming everyone here is going to be successful and they're going to eventually have like petabytes of data, the landing zone for how you store your information as a foundation, I think is really important to just like think about, make sure you're aware of the caveats of each of these, because there's definitely drawbacks to all of them. So the first icon here is BigQuery. And I think BigQuery has a ton of ease of use to get people into their systems early on. And BigQuery is free to store data. So that makes it a super appealing landing zone for a lot of people. The problem is the pricing structure of how you query that data and some of the limitations on partitioning makes it really difficult to do a lot of things on BigQuery just from a price perspective. And so they basically charge, I think it's like $5 per terabyte of data scanned. And of course, early on, it's like no big deal. But I was having conversations with a fairly large gaming company that was on on BigQuery, and they're just like, the fastest that we can get data, because we have so much, is daily. We can only process our data once a day, because if we were to process data faster, it would basically be a, if you were to do hourly, 24x almost cost an increase of their processing costs because of how things get partitioned and structured. And so one of the issues with BigQuery, and maybe they'll fix it later, is they only allow for segmenting of queries and data on partitions. And at least at the moment, I think the limit of partitions on a given table is around 4,000. And so you can't really do like minute partitions. You could do hourly partitions. Most people are typically doing day partitions. But if you have a lot of data within a day, your minimum cost of a query might be like $5 per query. And if you're a big company, you've got like hundreds of analysts, like it starts to get a little unwieldy. But I would say, early on, it's a great place to start. But I've seen, people have thoughts about moving to something that fits more of a tail end use case where just like tons of people are querying data, pulling data. That may be something to consider as you go through this journey. The next one is the S3 icon. So Amazon S3 is a really popular way to store data. I would say the conjunction with Kinesis and Firehose is probably the way that Amazon recommends to do it most commonly, but there's a side effect here as well. One of the issues here is that Kinesis streams, Firehose kind of has some thresholds for when it dumps data. And so I think it's something like 15 minutes or like 20 meg files. Well, when you're dealing with petabytes or terabytes of data a day, that's a crap ton of files. And the pricing structure of S3 is such that the cost of storing lots of small files can actually be more expensive than storing it in like a DynamoDB or the equivalent amount of data in DynamoDB. And so you got to think about like, okay, if I have this streaming system and I have this type of landing zone, what's going to be the most cost effective? We found that file sizes, under a gig are pretty cost effective. But, when you start to have like hundreds of thousands, millions of dollar S3 costs, just because scanning the data, storing it, archiving, Glacier costs start to go up kind of on a per file basis. It's something that you don't really think about until you hit it, and then you're like, crap, this is now a problem we have to deal with. The last one here is Snowflake, and this one is really popular. And once again, it's like all these systems are easy to get started. There's some hidden pitfalls here, but I would say Snowflake is one of those things that it's feature wise, it's super mature, robust, pretty fantastic. But cost wise, the complaint we always hear about, landing it into a data warehouse directly is the cost. It's one of the more expensive places to put your data. And the architectures and the ways that, third parties, if you read a lot of the Snowflake literature, everything's kind of event driven. And the side effect of this is like you're almost guaranteeing that your cluster is going to be up 24/7 all the time. You've probably got segment data integrated. They load in once an hour. You've got some events that are kind of like pulling from S3 Kinesis streams that are landing every 5 minutes. And if you're starting this way, it might not make as much sense to have your system running 24/7 if you have a small team of analysts that work normal business hours. One of the things that we typically see here is like, maybe they just need the ability to load all the data once a day, and then, have refreshes throughout the day while the analysts are working. They'll save 50% bill on Snowflake easily just by like having the clusters up during work hours. And so in most cases, if you were to think about like literature about like cold storage to hot storage, databases are second, third from the top in terms of hot storage in memory. is like the most expensive, right? And so usually landing zone wise, I would say Snowflake is kind of done out of like ease. But you're going to pay quite a bit more in terms of just keeping everything up. And so we kind of, as a proof point, have done optimizations for companies, kind of improved and given them architectural reviews and kind of implemented warehouses end to end. We had a case study with Scientific Games. They saved over $1 million in the first year. We were pretty quick in terms of just getting them completely off their old system. They had more productivity of their analysts, the queries ran faster, and they consolidated, 10 plus third-party solutions onto like a single platform to kind of simplify things. It just became a lot more manageable, maintainable. And they're able to get their data faster than they were before. So at this point, I guess I'm open for questions, just to review the things that we discussed, timestamps, consistency. Like I see that everywhere. I think I was having a conversation with Jake around, statistically, the number of messy data warehouses might align with the number of people that have messy bedrooms. There's kind of people habits around some of that kind of stuff. And so not everybody's type A neat freak personalities, but that may help at least early on when you're configuring some of this stuff. Simplification, delta processing. I mean, I think those are ways that you become so much more efficient in terms of getting your data ready, available quickly. And then the infrastructure of the eventing systems and the landing zones, definitely really important things that you want to think about when building out analytics for any kind of gaming company, and really any company in general. I think a lot of these things apply. So at this point, love to open it up to any kind of questions that anyone may have, but it's been a pleasure kind of sharing the low-hanging fruit that I think would save lots of companies a ton of money, time, effort, and headaches over the life of the company.
Thank you so much, Nom. We have actually a few questions in the chat right now, and everyone, as I read these out, Nom, please feel free to continue adding more questions. But our first one is from Vikram for Q&A. Any timelines or patterns to look out for when trying to decide where and why to place event trackers?
Timeline for patterns.
And if you need more context, Vikram, feel free to unmute and add more context to your question. You're welcome to do that.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Oh, okay. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, just to give you a little more context, I've just taken over a small team, so we're going to be less than 10 people. Taken over a game development team, and I'm essentially restarting the game team that was in limbo for about a year or so. So that's the mandate that's been given to me. So essentially, I'm essentially driving both product and design and data as well that we need to collect. So I'm just trying to decide and figure out, like you were saying, simplifying. I'm trying to figure out the best or the most efficient trackers I need to place to figure out what is it that players in my games are actually enjoying and what do they actually like to purchase. What are the entities or things they're doing in the games that we will be making that I need to keep an eye on. So I'm just looking to simplify that process as much as possible, as early as possible. In fact, I'm planning to have analytics and tracking even at prototype stage so we can get used to the process.
For sure.
Right at the start, right? So we can start making decisions even during pre-production and production based on data. So I'm just trying to see if there's any specific trackers that you feel would really help to get that process moving quicker, or anything you would want a small team to look out for.
Yeah, I would say the first thing, and it may seem a bit much, is to track almost every kind of like interaction or stage that a user has within a game.
Okay.
And let's say you're a bingo game, for example, right? You might have a game start event. You might have call outs from like the system that's more of like a system thing that gets sent out to various people. You'll have DOBs where people, they're like, oh, this number was called. How long does it take for that person to DOB? And these are all, I would say, loosely connected events. And so, but tracking them all is super helpful from a debugging perspective and
Okay.
because there's always two uses. One is like, how does product do analytics to drive more engagement and more revenue from your players? And then the other piece is this is also really helpful for the development teams to debug issues that come up within the game, right? And so you're kind of providing a log for yourself, and that log also just happens to be usable to help the downstream teams, the analytics teams, understand and provide analysis on KPIs for your game. I would say one of the things that, as people kind of go through this, and usually people start a little bit thinner and then they add more events as time goes on. But the other side effect is you have core things like obviously user ID. If you're in this bingo game scenario, you'll have like game IDs, you might have board IDs. Like there is, I would say, a sliding spectrum of like, what are the core IDs that are on every event? Because you're going to have, let's say 5 IDs that are on every event, device, user. You may have some like attribution fields associated with certain events that are kind of core. And then things that like match IDs, some more things that are specific to the events that may be submitted within the payload associated with that. And then of course you always have like the timestamps associated with these things. But for certain types of events, let's say you have a game end event or match end event, I would say you probably want to have some sort of summary of what the game thought the total scores or the outcomes of those things are. And those are also really helpful in terms of debugging and making sure like the flow of what a user experience is aligns with what the system has. It also helps you to catch cheaters, right? There's various cheating that always happens in games, mucking with like the amount of coins that they won or the prize pool or things like that, which is, you're providing checks or ways to do checks and balances so that you can detect these things and deal with, bad actors, so to speak, or bugs, or how to get more money out of these people.
Okay, no, that's actually helpful. And just one quick follow-up to something you said. You said small teams really early on sometimes will start with a limited set of trackers and then like add as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
My usual preferred approach is that do more and then refine down to what you actually need. Would you still recommend that if you're a small team and you're just like figuring out where your product needs to go early on?
I've seen it both ways. And it's actually kind of interesting. I would say, I think it depends on how data-driven your organization is. I would have probably agreed with you on the latter up until about 3 or 4 years ago. And then I
Okay.
worked with several clients where the executive teams or the types of games, they just weren't the types of business models that benefited from that much detail. And so there was a lot of over collection, a lot of over analysis, and the executive team, maybe it's because they weren't as data driven, they kind of opted to prefer the higher level, more directional stuff because if you're not maybe a microtransaction type model where you're providing purchase opportunities, let's say at certain stages of the game in the right way, you might not be able to take advantage of understanding some of the more detailed information. And so I think there is a little bit of tying it to like, what is the business model of the game, and maybe what is the information that would allow you to optimize or analyze your business model better, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, that makes sense. No, that's helpful, actually. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great dialogue. Thank you so much for asking that question. And we had one more question in the chat, actually, from Tep, and that is, with the criticality and propriety of data, how should gaming companies deal with data security?
So I would treat this in two kind of buckets. One is kind of data security in terms of like owning your data and what you do with your data. And then the other is kind of like from a compliance perspective, kind of given everything that's happening with like GDPR, CCPA, whatever the Canadian thing is these days. And so I'm going to assume that you're kind of talking about the latter, but maybe touch on the first one. I think that it's definitely an interesting and very complicated thing to think about, like at a macro level. But what we found is that it's actually quite simple for gaming companies in their actual operations for most cases. And so unless you're storing email, I would say most of the companies we work with don't really store much else personally identifiable information. It's usually like, you know, maybe usernames, aliases, things like that. Even the like financial transactions, like very few companies we know these days are dealing with like credit cards or anything like that that's kind of personally identifiable. And so what most of them kind of do is just say like, we're dealing with hundreds of millions of people, everything's anonymized anyways, we don't care about who any individual person is, maybe outside of like banning their account. But they kind of keep the people tables, anything they think could be personally identifiable information, separate from the analytics and warehousing. They provide some sort of unique ID or anonymous ID for each person, and that kind of gets carried through. But that's enough to be like, if someone hacks into your systems, like they'll see that you have X number of users and that these people play X number of games, but it's not like they could tie it back to any person, right? And that kind of information is almost like not that useful for anybody like hacking into your system. Like they have to have the exact same game experience or, to even make sense of that data. So in practice, I've seen it actually be less of an issue for gaming companies in terms of like data and security. And of course, you don't want your data to be leaked out, but at the same time, it's like, it's a really big and expensive thing to leak out petabytes of event data. More than likely someone might leak out KPIs and things like that, but it's usually not a crazy issue. Does that answer your question, Teep?
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself here. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ted.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Just want to, in terms of transactional security
the data
between
in today's day and age, oh, there you go. Sorry.
All right, I'm gonna say in terms of security, not just data at rest, but data in motion too, as well, from the client side all the way up to the, the main server. And of course, in terms of how does the vendor deal with the server data information too, as well.
I would say that might be a little bit outside the scope of maybe what we've seen people deal with in terms of data. I definitely think it's a concern, but probably more of a concern for the engineering teams up front in terms of managing what they have. most of probably our experience is dealing with it after the events happen and after the data comes back from various vendors and dealing with the fallout of that. And so that's more of like data, a little bit more data at rest than maybe what you're alluding to. And so I don't think I have a great answer for you that on that, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because I work at a university, and I'm also the advisor for our esports team. We have over 100, almost close to 100, 150, 200 students on the esports team, and they have about 8 different games and many teams per game, and they're competitive, and right now there's no monitoring of system if someone cheats, and so forth like that, and just concerned because our network security personnel have tracked down a foreign entity that actually trying to get in our system and trying to possibly sabotage the gaming. So
I would say from that perspective, you may be able to, if you have the right types of events and events don't tie up, you may be able to detect cheating or bad actors a little more rapidly. But I can't give you a good answer on how to stop that from happening at the upfront, kind of in your games.
all right, yeah, I know it's a little bit outside the scope of this presentation, but perhaps that's something that we perhaps IGDA could bring forth in terms of another meeting or actually like a presentation on that topic.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ted. And Nom, thank you so much for taking questions. I put a last call for questions in chat. So if anyone wants to submit any questions now, please feel free to do so. Or go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to speak openly. We've got just a few more minutes, so last call for questions. And then Nom, while we wait just like another minute for any last or lingering questions, feel free to plug Nom Nom Data a little bit more, and feel free to kind of close out the webinar as you see fit.
Yeah, super excited to just share our thoughts, help anybody out. You guys ever want rubber ducky to kind of bounce some ideas on, just send me an email. Happy to chat, love geeking out around data. And I think one of the things or surprising things that I found as I help companies is that I actually seem to spend a very large chunk of time talking with the engineering teams, because what we found is that ounce of prevention, if I can get clean data in, makes my life so much easier. So I'm definitely going to spend the time to help make that better upfront, because it pays dividends down the road in terms of my work-life quality, so to speak. Yeah, tons of fun. Oh, Jagan, you might still be muted.
Thank you. I thought I clicked it, but I guess I missed it. Thank you so much, Nom, for taking time to speak with all of us today. And to the attendees, thank you so much for coming. We will send a recording to all attendees who registered, so you can refer back. Feel free to reach out to Nom if you have any questions about Nom Nom Data and how y'all can work together. Otherwise, any last minute questions y'all can send to Nom via email. And we really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, all.
Thanks, everybody.